cop mocks elderly black woman for buying diapers, unaware of who the cashier is. Mrs. Louise Carter, a 78-year-old black woman, had faced many challenges in her life, but nothing could have prepared her for the humiliation she was about to endure on what should have been a routine trip to the grocery store. With her husband now bedridden at home and dependent on her care, Mrs. Louise found herself in the unenviable position of buying adult diapers. As she approached the checkout, her heart raced with anxiety, unaware that a police officer standing behind her would soon turn her simple errand into a public spectacle of mockery. In that moment of humiliation, when all seemed lost, an unexpected hero emerged. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching or listening from today, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy this gripping tale. The soft morning sun filtered through the worn curtains of Mrs. Louise's modest living room. At 78 years old, she moved with deliberate slowness, her joints creaking as she prepared for her weekly trip to the store. Standing before a small mirror, she adjusted her practical, faded dress, a relic from a time when things were easier, before life had dealt its harshest blows. Her eyes then drifted to the crumpled shopping list in her hand, where the last item read adult diapers. A familiar weight settled in her chest, a mixture of dread and resignation, a feeling that had become as routine as the shopping itself. Her gaze fell on her husband, Mr. Carter, lying motionless in the bed that now dominated their living room. Once a proud soldier, strong and vibrant, he was now partially paralyzed due to a spinal cord injury sustained during his service. Dependent on her for round-the-clock care, he lay trapped in a body that had betrayed him. On the nightstand beside the bed were the necessities of their new life: a bottle of medication, a half-empty glass of water, and a pack of adult diapers. Mrs. Louise lingered on the diapers, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions: love, duty, exhaustion, and a flicker of something deeper, more painful. "I'm heading to the store now, Carter," she said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of decades of companionship. Mr. Carter's sharp gaze met hers, even though he could no longer speak. His eyes conveyed a depth of emotion that words could never capture: gratitude, love, and a profound sadness for the burden he had become. Mrs. Louise leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I won't be long," she promised, her hand lingering on his cheek for a moment before she straightened, wincing slightly from the protest in her back. Gathering her worn purse and reusable shopping bags, she paused at the door, the thought of the trip ahead, of the looks, the whispers, the stares, making her want to retreat into the safety of their home. But the need was real, and Carter depended on her. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and opened the door, stepping out into the world, the weight of responsibility settling around her like a familiar but unwelcome cloak. The bell above the door chimed softly as Mrs. Louise entered Simmons's grocery store, a fixture in their small town for as long as anyone could remember. The store, with its narrow aisles and slightly musty smell, was a relic of a bygone era, much like Mrs. Louise herself. She nodded politely at the cashier behind the counter, a young man whose indifferent gaze barely registered her presence. Mrs. Louise was used to this invisibility, a gradual fading from the world's notice that came with age. Her steps were slow, partly due to the arthritis that had taken residence in her knees, but also because she wanted to remain unnoticed. She knew the layout of the store by heart, could navigate it with her eyes closed. But today, as always, her path to the hygiene aisle felt like a walk of shame. As she neared the dreaded section, her eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone was watching. The store was relatively empty at this hour, just a few early morning shoppers going about their business, but she still couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, judged. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pack of adult diapers, the plastic crinkling loudly in the quiet aisle. Mrs. Louise winced, sure that the sound would draw attention. She quickly clutched the package to her chest, as if hiding it could erase its existence or the need for it. The weight of the package in her arms was nothing compared to the weight in her heart. Each step towards the checkout felt like an eternity, a gauntlet of imagined stares and whispers. When she finally reached the front of the store, Mrs. Louise allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Soon, this part would be over, and she could return to the safety of home, to Carter, where the outside world and its judgments couldn't reach them. But as she approached the checkout line, a knot formed in her stomach. There were more people now, waiting in line, chatting idly. Mrs. Louise took her place at the end, tightening her arms around the package, wishing she could disappear into the worn linoleum floor beneath her feet. The line inched forward slowly, each moment an exercise in vulnerability. Mrs. Louise kept her gaze fixed on the floor, counting the scuff marks on the tiles, anything to avoid meeting the eyes of those around her. She was so close now, just a few more minutes and she could escape. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Mrs. Louise neared the front of the line, a booming voice cut through the quiet murmur of the store, shattering her hope for an unremarkable exit. The voice belonged to a police officer in uniform, standing just a few places behind her. He was chatting with another customer, his tone jovial. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" the officer said. "Nothing like a bit of sunshine to start the day, right?" Mrs. Louise tensed, her grip tightening on the package. She could feel the officer's presence behind her, an unwelcome reminder of the world beyond her small, carefully managed existence. As she inched closer to the checkout counter, she became acutely aware of the package in her arms. She tried to angle her body to hide it from view, but the crinkling of the plastic seemed to echo in her ears with every movement. "Would you look at that?" the officer said, his voice lowering but still audible. "Buying diapers at her age must be for her. Poor thing can't even take care of herself." The words hit Mrs. Louise like a physical blow. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The shame she had kept at bay came crashing over her, suffocating. She could hear quiet snickers, feel the weight of curious glances. The line, which had seemed interminable before, now felt like an endless walk of humiliation. Mrs. Louise's hands trembled as she placed the diapers on the counter, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mrs. Louise couldn't bring herself to look up. The thought of meeting the eyes of those around her, likely filled with pity or disgust, was unbearable. Behind the register, the young cashier, his name tag read Isaac, stood silently. Whatever he thought about the unfolding situation, his neutral expression didn't betray it. He moved efficiently, scanning her items without a word. As the beep of the scanner punctuated the tense silence, Mrs. Louise wished she could simply vanish. Every passing second felt like an eternity, each breath a struggle to keep tears at bay. The atmosphere was thick with unease as the officer's mocking words still hung in the air. "That's what happens when you get old," he said again, his voice loud enough to ensure it carried. "You start acting like a baby." His cruel laughter rippled through the store, each note sharper than a knife. Louise felt every pair of eyes turned toward her, some customers whispering behind their hands, others staring outright. Her hands gripped the shopping cart's handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to explain. She wanted to talk about Carter, how much he depended on her, how much they had sacrificed together, but her throat tightened, trapping the words inside. Instead, she stood there in silence, swallowing the shame and humiliation she couldn't escape. For a fleeting moment, she considered abandoning the diapers and walking out of the store. The thought of retreating to the safety of home, away from prying eyes and harsh words, was tempting. But then she thought of Carter. She couldn't leave him without what he needed. So, she remained still, her shoulders hunched under the weight of her duty and the cruelty she was enduring. Isaac continued scanning her items, his hands moving methodically, though his gaze flickered toward the officer more frequently now. His expression, still neutral, seemed to hold a growing unease. The officer, emboldened by the lack of resistance, smirked as he added, "Maybe they should have a separate line for people who need diapers. Keep them out of the way for the rest of us." This latest barb was met with gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Nervous laughter mixed with whispers of disapproval, but no one spoke up. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Isaac scanned the last of Louise's items, his eyes meeting hers briefly. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet recognition of the unfairness she was enduring. And then, breaking the thick silence, a voice rang out with quiet authority. "That's enough." All heads turned. It was Isaac. The young cashier, who had until now remained silent, stood straight, his steady voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The store fell silent, the soft murmur of onlookers ceasing as everyone froze. Even the officer, caught off guard, looked stunned. His smirk faltered. Isaac's eyes, calm but resolute, locked on the officer's. "You should be ashamed of yourself," he said, his tone unwavering. "Mocking her like that? It's disgraceful." For a moment, the officer looked as though he might retaliate. But something in Isaac's firm gaze made him hesitate. He crossed his arms, his confidence visibly shaken. The crowd, which had been complicit in its silence, began to shift. Some nodded in approval, others simply watched, unsure of how to respond. "You can't talk to me like that," the officer sputtered, attempting to reclaim his authority. "Do you even know who I am?" Isaac didn't flinch. His voice remained calm but firm. "I know exactly who you are," he replied. "You're someone who's supposed to protect and serve this community, not bully its most vulnerable members." The collective gasp that followed was audible, the words hanging heavy in the air. Louise, still clutching her cart, barely dared to breathe. She felt the weight of years of silence, of enduring without resistance, lift slightly in that moment. The officer, now visibly flustered, opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His authority, once so assured, now seemed fragile. Before the silence could stretch any further, the store manager appeared, his hurried steps breaking the tension. "What's going on here?" the manager asked, his voice edged with nerve. His eyes darted between the officer, Isaac, and Louise, clearly trying to assess the situation. The officer was the first to speak, his tone filled with indignation. "Your employee insulted me in front of everyone," he said, pointing at Isaac. "If this is how you run your store, don't expect me to come back." The manager visibly paled, stammering, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," but before he could continue, the officer stormed out, throwing one last glare at Isaac. A heavy silence followed his departure, broken only by the sound of the automatic door closing. The manager turned back to Isaac, his expression torn between anger and relief. But before he could say anything, Louise stepped forward. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Isaac turned to her, his expression softening. "You have nothing to apologize for, ma'am," he said gently. "None of this was your fault." The manager, still visibly tense, added quickly, "Mrs. Louise, your groceries are on the house today. Please, just take them." Louise hesitated, glancing between Isaac and the manager. She nodded her thanks, gathering her bags and making her way toward the exit. As she stepped outside into the sunlight, her mind raced. The humiliation she had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a mix of gratitude, worry, and something else, hope. She clutched the bags tightly as she began the walk home, the image of Isaac's steady gaze and firm voice replaying in her mind. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Hoping she might see Isaac again to properly thank him for his kindness, Mrs. Louise had no idea that fate had much more in store for them both. As her modest home came into view, a wave of relief washed over her. She climbed the steps to her porch, each one a reminder of the day's trials, and fumbled with her keys to unlock the door. Once inside, she set her bags down by the door and made her way to the living room, where Mr. Carter's hospital bed dominated the center of the space. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. With a soft sigh, she eased into her favorite armchair, positioned right next to her husband's bed. Her hands folded in her lap, she turned toward him, ready to recount the day's events. "Oh, Carter," she began, her voice carrying a mix of emotions. "You wouldn't believe what happened at the store today." Though Mr. Carter couldn't speak, his sharp eyes focused intently on her. Decades of marriage had created a bond that didn't need words, and his gaze encouraged her to continue. "There was a young man at the checkout," she explained, leaning forward slightly. "His name's Isaac. Carter, he stood up for me when no one else would. When that officer was mocking me, Isaac spoke out." Her voice trembled as she recounted the confrontation. She described Isaac's quiet courage, the way he faced the officer without hesitation. "It was like he saw me," she added softly. "Not just as an old woman buying groceries but as a person." Mr. Carter's eyes softened, and a look of understanding passed between them. Over the years, they'd both faced their share of prejudice and dismissiveness. They understood the rare, precious value of being truly seen. As night fell and the room darkened, Mrs. Louise couldn't stop thinking about Isaac. Who was he? Why had he felt compelled to step in when no one else would? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered yet persistent. "I hope he's all right," she murmured, more to herself than to Carter. "I hope he didn't get into trouble because of me." Reaching out, she took her husband's hand in hers. His fingers twitched slightly in response, a small movement that meant the world to her. "We've been through so much, haven't we?" she said softly, her voice tinged with the weight of shared experiences. Looking at Carter's face, lined with age yet still so dear, she felt a swell of gratitude and love. Yes, their life was hard, and yes, there were days when the burden seemed almost too heavy to bear. But they had each other, and that was no small thing. And now there was Isaac, a stranger who had shown unexpected kindness. As Mrs. Louise prepared for bed that night, a flicker of hope stirred within her. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. Little did she know, her brief encounter with Isaac was setting the stage for something much greater, something neither of them could have anticipated. As Mr. Carter's eyes gently encouraged him to take a seat, Isaac began to open up, sharing stories from his time in the service. Meanwhile, Mrs. Louise quietly slipped into the kitchen to prepare some tea. She couldn't quite explain why, but a deep feeling told her that something significant was unfolding in her living room, something that could change all their lives for the better. Little did she know just how right she was. In the days that followed, a remarkable transformation began within the Carter household. At first, Isaac was hesitant and unsure, but he quickly became an integral part of their daily life. Mrs. Louise watched with quiet joy as Isaac threw himself into helping around the house, tackling long-overdue repairs with hands that grew steadier with purpose each day. What truly warmed Mrs. Louise's heart, however, were Isaac's interactions with Mr. Carter. A bond formed between the two men that seemed to transcend words. Isaac spent hours by Mr. Carter's bedside, reading aloud or recounting stories from his own time in the service. As the weeks turned into months, Isaac's determination grew stronger. One evening, Mrs. Louise overheard him speaking softly to Mr. Carter about getting help for his drinking problem. The understanding and quiet pride in Mr. Carter's eyes seemed to give Isaac the courage he needed to take that crucial first step. Isaac began attending support group meetings and therapy, determined to work through his pain and trauma. With a renewed sense of purpose, he also started searching for a job and eventually secured a position as a maintenance technician at a local community center. He often shared his progress with Mr. Carter, who, though silent, expressed fatherly pride and encouragement through his eyes. The change in Isaac was nothing short of remarkable. The hollow-eyed young man who had once sat on a street corner now stood tall, approaching each day with purpose. Mrs. Louise, too, found her own life transformed. The weight of caring for Mr. Carter seemed lighter now, with Isaac always ready to lend a helping hand. As for Mr. Carter, though his body remained confined, a sparkle returned to his eyes. His spirit seemed to soar as he witnessed Isaac's progress and newfound strength. Over time, Isaac became more than a guest or a helper. He became the son Mr. and Mrs. Carter had always longed for but were never able to have. The injury Mr. Carter had sustained during the war had left them unable to conceive, a silent sorrow they had carried for years. In a beautiful twist of fate, They now found themselves with a grown son who brought renewed life and energy into their home. Within their modest house, 3 souls found healing in one another. Mrs. Louise, once weighed down by solitude and endless responsibilities, now found joy in nurturing a young man back to health and purpose. Mr. Carter, though unable to speak, discovered a new voice through Isaac, who brought his wisdom to life through action. And Isaac, once lost and alone, found not just a home but a purpose, his life forever changed by the unconditional love and quiet strength of the elderly couple.